Two young twins survive in the shadows of a city park, their lives held together by scraps and each other's dreams. But when a guilt-ridden officer stumbles upon their fragile shelter, he's not prepared for the shocking truth he's about to uncover, one that will unravel a web of lies, loss, and a secret powerful enough to destroy them all.
You're just kids. You don't belong out here. Where are your parents?
They're gone. And it's his fault.
Whose fault? What aren't you telling me?
Leave us alone. No one can protect us. Not even you.
What devastating secret is hidden in their mother's journal? And will the officer risk everything to save them? Or will it be too late? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The setting sun painted long shadows across Central Park's uneven grass, turning the oak trees into looming giants against the darkening sky. Katrina Wiley pulled a worn blanket from her backpack, her small hands working quickly as her twin sister Janny gathered fallen branches nearby. Their matching faces, though young at just 11 years old, carried a weariness that didn't belong on children. "Here," Katrina said, tossing one end of the blanket to Janai. They worked together without words, stretching the thin fabric between two park benches. It wasn't much, but it was home for now. Katrina's stomach growled as she watched a family pack up their picnic basket in the distance. She waited until they left, then nudged her sister. "Come on, let's check the trash can." They moved like shadows across the grass, their feet barely making a sound. Years of practice had taught them to be invisible. At the garbage bin, Katrina kept watch while Janae carefully dug through the contents. Her face lit up as she pulled out half a sandwich wrapped in plastic. "Still fresh?" Janny whispered, breaking it in two. She handed the bigger piece to Katrina, who tried to give it back. "You need it more." "We share everything," Janae insisted, pushing the bigger half back. "Remember what Mom always said?" Katrina's face darkened at the mention of their mother, but she took the sandwich piece without argument. Back at their makeshift shelter, Katrina gathered fallen branches while Janae spread out a crumpled map on the ground. The paper was torn at the edges, coffee-stained and wrinkled, but Janae traced the lines with gentle fingers as if it were made of gold. "Look at this place," Janae said, pointing to a spot on the map. "It's called Palm Springs. Can you imagine living somewhere with palm trees?" Her eyes sparkled with hope. "Maybe we could go there someday." Katrina arranged the branches in a loose circle around their blanket tent, creating a small barrier between them and the world. "We need to focus on now," she said, but her voice was gentle. "Winter's coming soon. We need better blankets." "I know." Janny folded the map carefully. "But sometimes dreaming helps, like Mom's stories about—" "Don't!" Katrina cut her off, then softened at Janny's hurt expression. "Just not tonight, okay?" A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness and both girls froze. Katrina's hand went to the small knife in her pocket, a dull blade she'd found behind a restaurant. Her heart pounded as she positioned herself between the sound and her sister. Jenny held her breath, her fingers digging into Katrina's arm. The footsteps grew closer, then faded away down another path. Only when the park fell silent again did they relax. Night settled over the park like a heavy blanket. The twins huddled together under their thin cover, sharing warmth as the temperature dropped. The stars peeked through the oak branches above them, tiny points of light in the vast darkness. "Katrina?" Janae's voice was barely a whisper. "Do you think we'll ever have a real home again like before?" Katrina stared up at the stars, thinking about all the things she couldn't control, all the promises she wasn't sure she could keep. But for Janay, she would pretend. "Yeah," she said softly. "We will. I promise." Above them, the stars continued their silent vigil over two small girls in a big city, their lives as fragile as the makeshift shelter protecting them from the night. Officer Marcus Darnell guided his patrol car through the city streets, where neon signs from luxury boutiques cast colorful reflections on rain-slicked asphalt. His eyes drifted between the road and the small framed photo on his dashboard, a smiling girl with bright eyes and untamed curls. Kira, his beautiful daughter, forever frozen at age 10. The radio crackled with routine updates. A noise complaint on 5th. Suspicious activity behind the mall. A cat stuck in a tree on Cedar Street. Darnell barely registered the chatter. Instead, his mind wandered to memories of pushing Kira on the swings, her laughter carrying across the playground like music. He pulled into a parking spot near City Park, killing the engine. The silence felt heavy. On nights like these, when the city seemed to hold its breath, the memories hit hardest. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on scattered leaves as he began his walk through the park. The path wound through clusters of oak trees, their branches creating strange shadows in the dim light of scattered lampposts. 3 years had passed since the accident, but the guilt still felt fresh. If he hadn't been working late that night, if he'd picked her up from soccer practice like he'd promised. "You can't change the past, Marcus," his ex-wife had said before she left. But that didn't stop him from trying to atone. He'd chosen the night shift deliberately, hoping the quiet hours would help him find peace. Instead, they just gave him more time to remember. A rustling sound drew his attention to a bench nearby. An elderly man huddled under several layers of worn clothing, clutching a plastic bag to his chest. "Evening, Joe," Darnell said softly, recognizing the regular face from his patrols. "Officer Marcus," Joe nodded, his weathered face creasing into a slight smile. "Quiet night?" "Too quiet." Darnell reached into his pocket and pulled out a granola bar. He'd started carrying extra snacks after meeting Joe last winter. "Here, it's getting cold out." Joe accepted the offering with trembling hands. "You're a good man, officer. Don't let anyone tell you different." Darnell's throat tightened. If only Joe knew about Kira, about how he'd failed when it mattered most. He could still hear the hospital monitors beeping, see the doctor's face as he delivered the news. The memory of his daughter's empty hospital bed haunted him more than any crime scene he'd encountered in his 15 years on the force. Finding a bench away from the main path, Darnell sat heavily. The streetlights flickered, creating an unsteady glow that matched his turbulent thoughts. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through old photos. Kira at her last birthday party, wearing the police cap he'd given her, declaring she wanted to be just like her daddy when she grew up. The weight of his service weapon felt heavier than usual against his hip as he stood, deciding to patrol the darker areas of the park on foot. Sometimes walking helped clear his head, helped quiet the constant chorus of what-ifs that plagued him. As he ventured deeper into the shadows, movement caught his eye near a cluster of benches. Something about the way the shadows shifted seemed deliberate, purposeful. A sharp gust of wind rustled through the oak trees, sending dead leaves skittering across the park's gravel path. The sudden sound of crunching footsteps jolted both twins awake. Jenny pressed herself against Katrina, their hearts pounding in unison as a beam of light swept through the darkness. "Stay quiet," Katrina whispered, her arm instinctively wrapping around her sister's shoulders. The flashlight beam danced closer, illuminating patches of their makeshift shelter. Officer Darnell's trained eye caught the subtle movement behind the bench, something too deliberate to be wind-blown debris. As his flashlight beam settled on their hiding spot, he saw them. 2 small figures huddled together, their dark eyes reflecting the light like frightened animals. "Hello there," he called softly, keeping his voice steady and gentle. "I'm Officer Darnell. Are you both all right?" Katrina sprang up, positioning herself between the officer and her sister. The dull knife trembled in her grip, but her stance was fierce and determined. Jenny clutched her precious map tighter, the paper crinkling in her nervous fingers. Darnell immediately knelt down, making himself smaller and less threatening. He clicked off his flashlight and held up both empty hands. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "I just want to make sure you're safe." "We're fine," Katrina shot back, her voice sharp but wavering slightly. "Just leave us alone." The officer's eyes adjusted to the darkness, taking in their makeshift camp. The thin blankets stretched between benches, a collection of food wrappers, and what looked like carefully arranged branches forming a crude barrier. His chest tightened at the sight. "How long have you been out here?" he asked, maintaining his distance and calm tone. Katrina's grip on the knife didn't loosen. "That's none of your business." Behind her, Janae remained silent, but her eyes were wide and fixed on Darnell's face, studying him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The wind picked up again, making their worn blanket flutter like a surrendering flag. "You're right," Darnell conceded, still kneeling. "You don't have to tell me anything, but it's going to get colder tonight, and I'm worried about you both." "We take care of ourselves," Katrina insisted, though her voice cracked slightly. Darnell nodded slowly, recognizing the protective, fierce love in Katrina's stance. It reminded him of how he'd felt about Kira. "I believe you," he said softly, "but everybody needs help sometimes." After a long moment, he stood up carefully, keeping his movements slow and predictable. "I'm going to go now," he said, "but I want you to know you're not alone, okay?" He backed away gradually, his heart heavy as he watched the twins' tense postures. When he reached the path, he turned and walked away, each step feeling like a betrayal of everything his badge stood for. Janae's whispered words carried on the night air. What if he comes back? The following evening brought a gentler breeze to the park. Officer Darnell's patrol car pulled up quietly near the entrance, its headlights cutting through the growing darkness before going dark. He reached for the passenger seat, gathering a thick blanket and a silver thermos filled with hot chocolate that still steamed when he unscrewed the cap to check its temperature. From their makeshift shelter, Katrina spotted him first. She nudged Janae, who had been absorbed in tracing the worn lines of her map with a dirty finger. "He's back," Katrina whispered, her muscles tensing. Janae's eyes widened as she watched the officers approach. Their legs felt heavy with exhaustion from a day of walking the city streets, searching for food and avoiding trouble. Running wasn't an option tonight. Darnell walked slowly, deliberately keeping his distance as he settled onto a nearby bench. He placed the thermos and blanket on the ground between them, creating a small offering that wouldn't force the girls to come too close. "Thought you might be cold," he said softly, his voice carrying just far enough to reach them. "It's getting chilly out here." The twins remained silent, but their eyes tracked his every movement. Katrina's hand stayed close to her hidden knife, while Janae peered around her sister's protective stance with growing curiosity. "You know," Darnell continued, gazing up at the emerging stars, "I used to think I had to handle everything on my own too." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Lost someone special to me. My daughter. Thought I could tough it out alone, but that just made things harder." The personal admission hung in the air between them. Janae shifted slightly, her attention caught by the steam rising from the thermos. The rich smell of chocolate drifted toward them on the evening breeze. Later that night, after Darnell had returned to his patrol car, he watched from a distance as the park settled into darkness. The twins remained huddled in their spot, two small shadows against the night. As the first hints of dawn began to color the sky, Darnell finally started his car to leave. Through his rearview mirror, he saw Janae reach toward the untouched thermos, only to have Katrina pull her hand back. "We can't trust him," Katrina scolded, though her eyes lingered on the supplies. "We're black girls out here alone, Janae. The world isn't kind to people like us. We have to be twice as careful." Janae's shoulders slumped, but she nodded, understanding the weight of her sister's words. Together, they crawled back under their thin blanket as the park began to stir with early morning joggers and dog walkers, both sisters uncertain about what the new day would bring. The fluorescent lights of the precinct buzzed overhead as Officer Darnell sat at his desk, his eyes fixed on the computer screen. A cup of coffee steamed beside his keyboard, forgotten in his intense focus. The usual bustle of the police station, ringing phones, shuffling papers, and casual conversations, faded into white noise as he typed. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he input the description. African-American female twins, approximately 10-11 years old. He added more details: their height, their weathered appearance, the distinctive way they stayed close together. Each keystroke felt heavy with purpose. "You're going down another rabbit hole, aren't you?" Officer Green's voice cut through his concentration. His partner leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "Just like last time." Darnell ignored him, clicking through various missing persons reports. No matches. He adjusted the search parameters, expanding the date range and geographical area. Still nothing. They have to be in the system somewhere, he muttered, reaching for his phone. He dialed the number for Haven House, a local shelter he knew well. "Sarah, it's Marcus Darnell. Listen, I'm looking for information about 2 girls." He repeated the description, careful to keep his tone professional despite the urgency he felt. The answer was the same. No one matching their description had sought help there. Next came calls to 3 more shelters, 2 hospitals, and finally, the foster care agency. Each conversation added another piece to a troubling puzzle. The social worker's hesitation when he mentioned twins. The shelter coordinator's sigh about kids who fall through the cracks. The foster care agent's vague reference to overcrowded homes. As he hung up from the last call, memories of Kira flooded his mind. Her smile in the framed photo on his desk seemed to mock his helplessness. She would have been about their age now. "Marcus," Officer Green's voice softened, "don't let this consume you. We both know how that ends." Darnell rubbed his tired eyes, the screen's glare having left spots in his vision. The database's cursor blinked steadily, waiting for another search that would likely yield nothing. But the absence of information told its own story, one of children slipping through society's safety nets, of systems too overwhelmed to catch everyone who fell. He leaned back in his chair, his coffee now cold and untouched. The mystery of the twin situation had only deepened with each dead end. Their fear, their survival skills, their fierce protection of each other, it all pointed to a story they weren't ready to tell. Looking at Kira's photo once more, Darnell felt the familiar weight of guilt pressing down on his chest. These girls needed help, just as his daughter had needed him that night. This time, he wouldn't fail. He couldn't. The decision crystallized in his mind as he stared at the unhelpful screen. He would need to ask the twins directly about their story. No more dancing around the truth. No more gentle approaches. It was time to confront them and find out what they were running from. Under the threadbare blanket, Katrina and Janae huddled close, their small flashlight casting eerie shadows on their faces. The park's nighttime sound seemed far away as they whispered to each other, their voices heavy with memories they usually kept locked away. "Do you remember that night?" Janae asked softly, her fingers tracing the worn edges of her map. "The smoke was so thick." Katrina's jaw tightened. The memories came rushing back, the acrid smell of smoke, their mother's screams, their father trying to reach them through the flames. The fire had started in the middle of the night, consuming their small house with frightening speed. They never found out what caused it, though Katrina remembered overhearing whispers about faulty wiring and insurance investigations. "Mom always sang to us before bed," Janny continued, her voice cracking. "That last night, too." The twins fell silent, remembering their parents, their mother's warm smile and gentle hands braiding their hair, their father's deep laugh and the way he'd swing them around in the backyard. They weren't perfect, sometimes struggling to pay bills or arguing late at night, but they had been loving. After the fire came the foster system. Their first placement had seemed promising, a house in the suburbs with a manicured lawn. But inside, it was a different story. 6 children crammed into 2 small bedrooms, never enough food to go around, and foster parents who seemed more interested in the monthly checks than the children's well-being. "Remember how they always locked the pantry?" Katrina's voice was bitter, "and blamed us when things went missing just because we were black." The memories of their last foster home were the darkest. Their foster father had been a tall man with cold eyes and heavy hands. He'd seemed nice at first, but his true nature emerged quickly. The twins learned to tiptoe around him to make themselves invisible, but it wasn't enough. That night, Janae shuddered and Katrina pulled her closer. They both remembered. His thundering footsteps up the stairs, the smell of alcohol on his breath, the way he'd grabbed Janae's arm so hard it left bruises. Katrina had stepped between them, taking the blow meant for her sister. That same night, they'd packed their few belongings and slipped out the window. They knew no one would believe them if they reported him. They'd tried before with other foster parents, only to be dismissed or punished for lying. "We did the right thing," Katrina said firmly, though her voice trembled slightly. We had to leave. Janae nodded, clutching her map tighter. It was their symbol of hope, even if they had nowhere specific to go. The flashlight flickered, its batteries growing weak. We can't let him find us, Katrina said, her voice steely as she stared into the darkness beyond their makeshift shelter. The weight of their secret pressed down on them like a physical thing, reinforcing their decision to trust no one with their story. The evening air grew crisp as Officer Darnell approached the familiar park bench, his footsteps deliberately heavy to announce his presence. In his hands, he carried a brown paper bag that crinkled softly with each step. The aroma of fresh sandwiches wafted through the air as he placed the bag and 2 water bottles on the ground, a few feet from where he knew the twins were hiding. From behind their makeshift shelter, Katrina and Janae watched him with careful eyes. Their stomachs growled at the smell of food. They hadn't eaten anything substantial since yesterday's half-eaten hot dog from a street vendor's trash. Darnell settled onto a nearby bench, leaving plenty of space between them. He began speaking in a casual tone, as if talking to himself. You know, when I was your age, I used to spend hours in parks like this. My favorite thing was climbing trees. Got stuck up in one once. My mom was so mad she made me clean the garage for a month. He chuckled at the memory, his voice warm and genuine. Katrina's grip on Janae's arm loosened slightly as they listened. These sandwiches remind me of the ones my grandmother used to make, Darnell continued, gesturing to the paper bag. She always said food tastes better when you share it with others. Janae's stomach rumbled loudly and Katrina bit her lip. The food was so close and they were so hungry. After a moment's hesitation, she slowly emerged from their hiding spot, her eyes fixed on Darnell as she quickly snatched the paper bag. She retreated just as swiftly, pulling out 2 wrapped sandwiches and handing one to Janae. Darnell kept talking, sharing stories about his childhood dog and the time he tried to teach himself juggling. His voice remained steady and unthreatening, filling the silence without demanding anything in return. As they ate, Janae's eyes began to sparkle with interest in his stories. When Darnell described falling off his bike while trying to impress a girl in his class, a small smile tugged at her lips. Katrina, though still wary, gave him a slight nod when he mentioned bringing more food tomorrow. Standing up to leave, Darnell brushed off his uniform pants. I'll be here tomorrow, same time, he said gently. Just in case you need anything. The twins remained silent, but Janae watched him go, still holding her half-eaten sandwich. Once he was out of earshot, Katrina muttered, We'll see, before they retreated back to their shelter for the night. The moonless night wrapped the park in shadows, broken only by the dim glow of distant streetlights. Katrina moved quietly between the trees, returning from her evening scavenging at the nearby dumpster behind the pizza place. Her worn shoes barely made a sound on the damp grass. Voices cut through the darkness, low, threatening whispers that made her freeze mid-step. Her heart pounded as she clutched the half-empty pizza box to her chest. Well, look what we got here, a male voice sneered. From the shadows emerged 4 teenagers, their faces hard and mean in the dim light. The oldest one, wearing a red hoodie, stepped forward. All alone out here, little girl? Katrina backed away slowly, her eyes darting between the teens as they spread out, cutting off her escape routes. Her back hit a tree trunk. Just leave me alone, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. That's some food you got there, another teen said, pointing at the pizza box. Might as well share with us. Katrina's survival instincts kicked in. She ducked under one teen's reaching arm and sprinted toward the path, her feet pounding against the ground. She weaved between trees and benches, but the teens were faster, their longer legs eating up the distance. Janae! She screamed as rough hands grabbed her arm, spinning her around. The pizza box fell, scattering its contents across the grass. Katrina kicked and struggled, but the grip on her arm only tightened. Suddenly, a bright beam of light cut through the darkness. Police! Step away from her now! Officer Darnell's commanding voice boomed across the park. His flashlight beam swept across the teens' startled faces as he advanced quickly toward them, one hand resting on his holstered weapon. The teens scattered like roaches, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared. Katrina slumped against a tree, her breathing ragged. Darnell hurried to her side, kneeling down. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice gentle but urgent. Katrina shook her head, avoiding his eyes. Her hands were trembling as she tried to gather the scattered pizza slices. "The park isn't safe at night," Darnell said, helping her pick up the food. "Please, let me help you and your sister. There are places you can stay, people who can protect you." "We don't need protection," Katrina snapped, but her voice wavered. "We take care of ourselves." "You're just children," Darnell insisted. "You shouldn't have to face these dangers alone." Back at their makeshift shelter, Jenna rushed to hug her sister. Katrina recounted what happened, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. Darnell sat on a nearby bench, watching over them with growing frustration. "Those guys could have really hurt you," Jenna whispered, clutching her sister's arm. "But they didn't," Katrina replied firmly, though her hand still trembled. "We're fine. We don't need help." Darnell watched as Jenna cast uncertain glances his way, her expression suggesting she wasn't as convinced of their self-sufficiency as her sister pretended to be. The lights buzzed overhead in the cramped child services office as Officer Darnell shifted uncomfortably in his hard plastic chair. Ms. Peterson, the social worker assigned to his case, typed mechanically at her computer, barely glancing up as he spoke. The constant ring of phones and shuffle of papers created a din that made it hard to concentrate. "They're just kids," Darnell explained, leaning forward. "Two black twin girls, probably around 10 or 11. Living in the park with nothing but a blanket between them and the elements." Ms. Peterson sighed, pushing her wire-rimmed glasses up her nose. "Without proper identification or documentation, our hands are tied. We need names, birth certificates, proof of residency, something to start the process." "Process?" Darnell's voice rose slightly. "These children need help now, not paperwork." "Officer Darnell," Ms. Peterson said tiredly, "we have protocols. Even if you brought them in today, we'd need to verify their identity, locate any existing family members, and find an appropriate placement. That takes time." "Time they don't have," Darnell insisted. "Winter's coming. They're already malnourished, and there are predators in that park." Ms. Peterson shuffled through a stack of papers on her desk, pulling out several forms. "If you can convince them to come to a shelter, we can start the intake process. But without their cooperation—" "A shelter?" Darnell interrupted. "They're terrified of the system. They ran away from something, and I need to know what before I force them back into it." "Then I'm afraid there's nothing we can do," Ms. Peterson replied, her tone flat. "Our resources are already stretched thin. We have dozens of documented cases waiting for placement." Darnell stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. "So that's it? We just leave them out there?" "If you find them again, call it in. We'll send someone to collect them," Ms. Peterson said, already turning back to her computer screen. "Collect them? They're not stray dogs." Darnell's voice boomed through the office, causing several heads to turn. He took a deep breath, trying to control his anger. "These are children who need help, not paperwork and procedures." Without waiting for a response, Darnell stormed out of the office, muttering under his breath about bureaucrats and broken systems. He stood outside the building, watching the sun sink behind the city's towering buildings. The frustration churned in his stomach as he pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found Elena's number. She was a street-level social worker he'd worked with before, someone who understood that sometimes the rules needed to bend to save lives. His finger hovered over the call button, knowing he needed to find another way to help the twins before it was too late. Elena's office was barely bigger than a closet, with filing cabinets crammed against every wall and sticky notes covering nearly every surface. The afternoon sun filtered through a dusty window, casting long shadows across her cluttered desk. When Darnell called, she'd immediately cleared her schedule. "Tell me everything," she said, leaning forward in her creaky chair as Darnell explained about the twins. Her dark eyes lit up with recognition as he described their situation. She absently touched the small scar on her chin, a reminder of her own past on the streets. "Two black twin girls, you say?" Elena's voice softened. "Living in the park with just a blanket?" "I've tried everything by the book," Darnell said, running a hand over his tired face. Child services is useless. The book doesn't always work for kids like them, like I was, Elena said. She stood up and grabbed her worn leather jacket. Show me. At the park, Elena and Darnell kept their distance, watching the twins from a bench several yards away. Katrina was organizing their meager belongings while Janae studied her beloved map. See how Katrina positions herself? Elena whispered. Always between her sister and potential threats. I used to do the same with my little brother. You were on the streets too? Darnell asked, surprised. Elena nodded, her eyes never leaving the twins. 3 years, from 13 to 16. Mom's boyfriend was violent. The streets felt safer than home. She paused, watching Katrina's defensive posture. These girls, they're not just running from something, they're running from someone. How do we help them if they won't trust us? Trust is earned in drops and lost in buckets, Elena said. We start small. No pressure, no demands. She stood up slowly. Let me try something. Elena approached the twins' makeshift shelter, her movements deliberate and open. Katrina immediately stepped in front of Janae, but Elena noticed their slight hesitation when they saw her face. Another black woman, someone who looked like them. I'm Elena, she said, keeping her distance. I bring my own food to share when I visit kids in the park. Would you like some? She pulled out 2 wrapped sandwiches from her bag and set them on the ground. The twins remained silent, but their eyes followed her every move. Elena sat down cross-legged on the grass, unwrapping her own sandwich. You know, she said casually, this park used to be my spot too about 20 years ago. That oak tree over there made a great shelter when it rained. Janae's eyes widened slightly while Katrina's stance softened just a fraction. Elena didn't push further, simply eating her sandwich in companionable silence. Back at the bench with Darnell, Elena watched the twins whisper to each other, occasionally glancing their way. This won't be easy, she said with a faint smile. But they're strong. Stronger than most. Darnell nodded, feeling hopeful for the first time in weeks. Together they began mapping out a careful plan to help the twins, one small step at a time. The street lamp cast a pale yellow glow over Janae as she sat cross-legged on the ground, carefully turning the brittle pages of a weathered journal. Its edges were black with burn marks, and some pages crumbled at the corners when touched. Nearby, Katrina, Darnell, and Elena huddled together, their voices low as they discussed their next steps. I think I found something, Janae's voice cut through their conversation. Everyone turned to look at her. She held up the journal with trembling hands. This was Mom's. It survived the fire somehow. Elena moved closer, her eyes soft with concern. May I see? Janae nodded and pointed to several entries. Look here. She keeps writing about someone named Mark. Her finger traced along the faded ink. Sometimes she calls him a friend, but other times... Her voice trailed off. What do you mean? Darnell asked, leaning in. Here she writes, Mark offered help today, but 3 pages later it says, Can't trust M, too dangerous. Janae's brow furrowed. And there's something about a safe, too. Katrina crossed her arms. We shouldn't be digging into this. It could be dangerous. But don't you want to know? Janie looked up at her sister. I remember Mom writing in this late at night. She'd jump whenever Dad came into the room like she was hiding something. Elena gently took the journal, studying the mysterious entries. There are coordinates here, and these symbols. She pointed to various sketches scattered throughout the pages. Beneath the ashes, Darnell read over her shoulder. Where the light meets shadow. These could be clues to the safe's location. Or they could be nothing, Katrina insisted. We're finally getting help and now you want to chase ghost stories? Janae pulled the journal back, holding it close to her chest. They're not ghost stories. Mom was trying to tell us something. She flipped through more pages until she found what she was looking for. Her finger traced a simple sketch of an oak tree. I remember this. I know where to start, she said quietly. Everyone looked up at the oak trees looming against the night sky, their branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. The park was quiet except for the soft rustling of pages, and the gentle hum of crickets. A battery-powered lantern cast a warm glow over the small group huddled around it. Janai's fingers trembled as she carefully turned the worn pages of her mother's journal, while Katrina, Darnell, and Elena leaned in close to see. "Look at this," Janai said, pointing to a detailed sketch that appeared multiple times throughout the journal. "It's some kind of warehouse. Mom drew it over and over." Elena adjusted her glasses, studying the drawing. These numbers in the margin, they could be coordinates. "Your mother mentioned this place?" Darnell asked gently. Katrina nodded slowly, her usual skepticism giving way to recognition. "She used to whisper about it sometimes, said it was somewhere we could go if—" She swallowed hard. "If something happened." "Here," Janai said, turning to another page. She wrote more numbers and look, the same warehouse from different angles. Her finger traced the careful pencil lines of the building's facade. Darnell and Elena exchanged worried glances. The implications of a secret safe house were troubling, suggesting their mother had been preparing for something dangerous. "We shouldn't," Katrina said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. What if we find something we don't want to know?" "But it's Mom's writing," Jenny insisted, clutching the journal closer. "She wanted us to find this. Why else would she keep drawing it?" Elena leaned forward, her face gentle but serious. "Whatever's there, you won't have to face it alone. We can help you." "I'll go with you," Darnell offered, his voice steady and reassuring. "We'll check it out together, make sure it's safe." Katrina stared at the warehouse sketch, her shoulders tense. The lantern flickered, casting dancing shadows across the journal's pages. After a long moment, she nodded slowly. "Okay," she whispered. "We'll go." Darnell squeezed her shoulder supportively. "Whatever we find, we'll handle it together." Janai traced the warehouse drawing with her finger, her voice barely audible. "This has to be it." The abandoned warehouse loomed against the night sky like a forgotten giant, its broken windows gaping like dark, empty eyes. Graffiti covered the weathered walls in wild splashes of color, barely visible in the dim moonlight. Darnell's flashlight beam cut through the darkness as he led the way, with Elena and the twins following close behind. "Stay together," Darnell whispered, his footsteps careful and measured. "Watch your step." The heavy metal door groaned as they pushed it open. The sound echoed through the empty space, making Katrina flinch. Janai gripped her sister's hand tightly as they entered. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the musty smell of decay. Their footsteps creaked on the wooden floorboards, each sound seeming to amplify in the vast emptiness. Rusted machinery cast strange shadows on the walls as Darnell's flashlight swept across them. "Look at all this stuff," Elena murmured, gesturing to the piles of abandoned equipment and scattered debris. Janai moved slowly through the space, her eyes scanning every corner. Something caught her attention, a stack of wooden crates that seemed oddly placed compared to the random clutter around them. "Over here," she called softly, already moving toward the crates. Together, they carefully shifted the heavy boxes aside. Beneath them, partially hidden under years of dust, was a metal hatch set into the floor. "Help me with this," Darnell said, gripping the handle. With Elena's help, they managed to pry it open, revealing a small compartment beneath. Inside lay 3 items: a dusty photo album bound in faded leather, a single brass key that gleamed dully in the flashlight beam, and an envelope yellowed with age. Written across the front in neat handwriting were the words, "My children." Katrina reached for the letter with trembling hands while Janai picked up the photo album. As they gathered close, Janai began reading the letter aloud, her voice shaking with emotion. The words revealed their mother's fears and warnings about a powerful enemy, stressing the importance of staying together and protecting the journal at all costs. When Janai reached the final line, "Trust no one but yourselves," her voice cracked. Katrina's fingers closed tightly around the brass key, her jaw set with determination. The photo album lay open in Janai's lap, showing pictures of happier times, their family whole and smiling. Darnell suddenly tensed, his posture alert. "We need to get out of here," he said urgently, his eyes scanning the shadows. The group quickly gathered their discoveries and made their way toward the exit. leaving the empty warehouse behind them. Back at the park, Elena spread out blank papers on a worn picnic table, carefully copying every detail from the mysterious letter and journal. Her pen moved swiftly across the pages as she duplicated the cryptic symbols and notes, making sure nothing was missed. "We need multiple copies," she explained, her voice low and focused. "Keep them in different places, just to be safe." Darnell sat nearby, his phone's screen illuminating his concerned face as he searched through public records. The brass key they'd found felt heavy in his pocket. He'd been making calls all morning, trying to match it to any registered addresses in the city. "Something's not right," Katrina muttered, pacing behind the bench where Janae sat. Her eyes darted around the park's perimeter. "It feels like we're being watched." Darnell's phone buzzed. His contact at the precinct, Detective Rivera, had sent him a file. As he read through it, his expression darkened. "Gerald Kane," he said, the name coming out like a curse. "Your former foster father. He's got connections to organized crime, money laundering, extortion, suspected arson." Janae's hands began to shake. "Arson?" "The fire that killed your parents," Elena said softly, understanding dawning on her face. "It might not have been an accident." Katrina stopped pacing, her fists clenched. "He was always asking about Mom's things, searching our rooms when he thought we were asleep." "The journal," Elena realized, looking at the worn notebook. "He must think there's evidence in here that could expose him." Darnell leaned forward, his voice tight with concern. "This is bigger than we thought. Kane's not just some abusive foster parent, he's dangerous. He's got people working for him, and if he's looking for that journal..." "We remember," Katrina interrupted, her voice hard. "The way he'd stand in our doorway at night, just watching. How he'd get angry if we touched any of Mom's old things." Janae clutched the journal closer to her chest, her eyes wide with fear. "He used to say he'd find us if we ever ran away. That he had friends everywhere." Elena placed a gentle hand on Janae's shoulder. "You're not alone anymore. We'll protect you." Darnell stood up, his jaw set with determination. "This man won't stop until he gets what he wants." "He can't have it," Janae whispered, holding the journal tightly. "Mom wanted us to keep it safe." The peaceful night shattered as bright headlights suddenly flooded the park, casting harsh shadows across the grass. A black van screeched to a halt near their bench, its doors sliding open with a metallic clang. Several men in dark clothing jumped out, their faces hard and determined. "Give us the journal!" one of them shouted, advancing quickly. "Hand it over and no one gets hurt!" Katrina's hand shot out, grabbing Janae's wrist. "Run!" she screamed, yanking her sister to her feet. The journal was clutched tightly against Janae's chest as they bolted into the darkness. Darnell moved instantly, positioning himself between Kane's men and the fleeing twins. "Elena, go with them," he ordered, before charging at the nearest attacker. The chase spilled into the city streets. Their feet pounded against concrete as they darted through narrow alleys, the sounds of pursuit close behind. More headlights appeared, a second van cutting off their path. "This way," Darnell called out, guiding them down a side street he knew well from his patrols. The group ducked under a half-raised loading dock gate and emerged into a maze of warehouses. Kane's men were relentless. Their shouts echoed off brick walls as more vehicles joined the pursuit, their tires squealing against asphalt. "Keep moving," Elena urged, supporting Janae, who was starting to tire. They weaved through a crowded night market, pushing past startled shoppers. Darnell spotted one of Kane's men cutting through the crowd toward them. In one fluid motion, he stepped forward, using his police training to take the man down with a swift series of strikes. "The church!" Elena gasped, pointing to a dark silhouette ahead. "We can hide there!" The abandoned church loomed before them, its stone walls offering promise of sanctuary. They raced up the worn steps, Darnell quickly picking the ancient lock. The heavy wooden doors groaned as they pushed inside and sealed them shut. In the dusty sanctuary, their heavy breathing echoed off vaulted ceilings. Darnell moved through the shadows, checking for any other entrances while Elena helped the twins settle behind an overturned pew. "Is everyone okay?" Darnell asked, returning to the group. His knuckles were scraped raw from the fight. Katrina stood up, her face set with fierce determination. She looked at the journal in Janae's trembling hands. "This ends now," she declared, her voice steady despite their ordeal. Distant sirens wailed through the night, their sound carrying through the church's broken windows. Elena guided the old sedan through the quiet city streets, her hands steady on the wheel despite the tension in the air. The headlights swept across empty sidewalks and darkened storefronts. In the back seat, Katrina and Janae sat close together, the journal hidden beneath Janae's worn jacket. "We're almost there," Elena said softly, turning down a narrow street lined with brick buildings. She pulled up to an unmarked structure, its facade plain except for a small sign that read, "Bright Horizons Youth Shelter," in simple lettering. "This is a safe place," Elena explained, turning to face the twins. "They specialize in helping kids who need protection. No one will find you here." Inside, the shelter's fluorescent lights revealed clean hallways and simple but welcoming decor. A woman with kind eyes introduced herself as Ms. Martinez, the night supervisor. She spoke in gentle tones, careful not to make any sudden movements that might startle the twins. "We have a room ready for you," Ms. Martinez said, leading them up a carpeted staircase. "You'll have your own space with real beds." The room was small but neat, with 2 twin beds covered in fresh linens. A window overlooked a quiet courtyard, and a small dresser stood against one wall. For the first time in months, the twins faced the prospect of sleeping somewhere secure and warm. Janae ran her hand over the soft blanket, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's so clean," she whispered. Katrina remained by the door, her posture tense as she scanned the room for potential exits. "We can't stay long," she muttered. "Kane will find us." In the hallway, Darnell and Elena spoke in hushed tones about security measures. "The shelter has protocols," Elena explained. "No one can access resident information without proper clearance. The staff are trained to handle sensitive cases." "Kane has connections," Darnell replied, his voice heavy with concern. "We need to think several steps ahead." Back in the room, Janae had already settled onto one of the beds, her body relaxing into the mattress. Despite her wariness, even Katrina couldn't resist sitting on the edge of her bed, feeling the strange comfort of a real pillow beneath her hands. Ms. Martinez brought them clean clothes and toiletries, explaining the shelter's daily routines and safety procedures. "You're safe here," she assured them. "We have security systems and staff on duty around the clock." The twins took turns in the small attached bathroom, the luxury of hot water and soap almost overwhelming after so long without. When they emerged, wearing clean pajamas provided by the shelter, they looked younger, more vulnerable. Darnell watched from the doorway as the twins settled into their beds. "Try to get some rest," he said. "Elena and I will be close by." The morning sun filtered through the shelter's windows, casting long shadows across the common room's worn furniture. Darnell sat at a table with the group, turning the warehouse key over in his hands. Its brass surface caught the light, the numbers etched on its surface now clearly visible. "This belongs to a safety deposit box at First National," Darnell explained, his voice low to avoid being overheard by other shelter residents. "I checked the records. It's still active." Elena leaned forward, her dark eyes focused on the key. "We need to see what's inside. The twins should stay here where it's safe while we check it out." Katrina's shoulders tensed. "Why can't we come with you?" "The shelter's security is top-notch," Elena assured her. "And the fewer people at the bank, the less attention we'll draw." At the bank, Darnell and Elena followed a stern-faced clerk to the vault. The safety deposit box made a hollow sound as the key turned. Inside, they found a manila folder stuffed with documents, its edges yellowed with age. Elena spread the contents across the private viewing table. Old photographs spilled out, showing happier times, the twins as toddlers, their parents smiling at birthday parties. But beneath the photos lay darker treasures, newspaper clippings about suspicious fires, property deeds with signatures that didn't quite match, and a handwritten note that made Elena's breath catch. "Look at this," she whispered, showing Darnell the threatening message. The words were clear. "Sign over the property, or your family pays the price. K." Back at the shelter, Janae's hands trembled as she examined a partially burned letter. Her mother's familiar handwriting covered the surviving portion. "That's Mom's writing," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "She wrote about Cain trying to force them to sell their property. They refused to give in." The pieces began falling into place. Cain's attempts at extortion, the mysterious fire, the parents' deaths. It formed a pattern of deliberate violence and intimidation. "He killed them," Katrina said flatly, her fists clenched, "because they wouldn't do what he wanted." "This is evidence," Darnell said, carefully organizing the documents. "Real evidence we can use against him." But Katrina's eyes narrowed as she watched Darnell handle the papers. "Why should we trust you with this?" she asked suddenly. "How do we know you're not working for him?" The question hung heavy in the air, creating a palpable tension. Janae looked between her sister and Darnell, uncertainty clouding her features. The trust they'd built seemed suddenly fragile, balanced on a knife's edge. The yellow lights of the shelter's dining area buzzed overhead as Katrina stood facing Darnell, her small frame rigid with anger. The morning's earlier peace had shattered like glass. "You're just like all the others," Katrina spat, her voice trembling, making promises, pretending to care. "But look at us. We're still running, still in danger. Nothing's changed." Darnell took a step forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Katrina, please. Everything I've done has been to protect you and Janae." "Protect us?" Katrina's laugh was bitter. "Cain's men found us at the park. Some protection." Janae stood between them, her eyes darting back and forth. Maybe Darnell really is trying to help," she said softly, but uncertainty crept into her voice. "He's a cop, Janae." Katrina turned to her sister. "Cops didn't help when Mom and Dad died. They didn't help in the foster homes. They never helped kids like us." Elena watched from the doorway as the scene unfolded, her heart heavy. She could see Darnell's pain written across his face as each accusation landed like a physical blow. "I'm not asking you to trust the system," Darnell said. "I'm asking you to trust me." "Trust you?" Katrina's voice cracked. "We don't need anyone's help. We never did." She grabbed their worn backpack and began stuffing their meager belongings inside. Janae hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. "Katrina..." "We're leaving," Katrina declared, grabbing Janae's hand. "Now." Darnell stepped forward. "Please don't do this. It's not safe out there." But Katrina was already pulling Janae toward the door. The younger twin cast one last glance at Darnell, a mix of regret and resignation in her eyes, before following her sister. Darnell stood frozen, watching them go. His shoulders slumped as the door closed behind them. "This is my fault," he whispered. "I pushed too hard." Elena placed a hand on his shoulder. "They're more vulnerable now than ever," she said urgently. "Cain is still out there. We need to find them before he does." Darnell watched through the window as the twins' small figures moved down the street. They looked so young, so fragile against the sprawling city backdrop. His jaw clenched as he whispered, "I won't lose them." The morning sun cast long shadows through the city's narrow alleys as Katrina and Janae made their way through the less crowded streets. Their footsteps echoed off brick walls as they stuck to the shadows, avoiding the busy main roads. "We'll find somewhere safe," Katrina whispered, squeezing Janae's hand. "Maybe that old warehouse district we passed last week." Janae clutched her worn backpack closer. "I'm scared, Katrina. What if..." The screech of tires cut through the air. A black SUV pulled up sharply beside them, its tinted windows rolling down. Before either girl could react, 3 men in dark clothes jumped out. "Get them!" one shouted. The twins bolted, their feet pounding against the pavement, but the alley was a dead end. Katrina pushed Janae behind her as the men approached. "Leave us alone!" Katrina screamed, but her voice shook. The men moved quickly, grabbing both girls despite their struggles. Jani's cry was muffled as they were roughly shoved into the SUV's back seat. The door slammed shut, and the vehicle peeled away from the curb. Meanwhile, at the shelter, Darnell paced the common room, checking his phone repeatedly. Elena sat at a computer, trying to track the twins' usual locations. "Something's wrong," Darnell muttered. "They should have shown up somewhere by now." A call came in from the precinct. Darnell's face darkened as he listened to the report. A witness had seen 2 young girls being forced into a black SUV near the park. "Kane," he growled, slamming his fist against the wall. He immediately began making calls, reaching out to every contact he had on the force. Elena pulled up the documents they'd found in the safety deposit box. "Wait," she said, pointing to an address. "This property. It's an old warehouse Kane owns through a shell company. The deed was in with the other evidence." Darnell leaned over her shoulder, studying the address. His jaw clenched as he recognized the location, an industrial area on the city's outskirts. The SUV drove for what seemed like hours to the terrified twins. When it finally stopped, the men dragged them into a dimly lit basement. They tied the girls' hands and left them alone in the darkness. "Stay close," Katrina whispered to Janae, shifting so their shoulders touched. Their faces were pale with fear as they huddled together in the shadows. In the precinct, Darnell stood before a large city map, his finger tracing the route to Kane's warehouse. "I'll find you," he whispered, his voice heavy with determination. Elena's fingers traced the worn edges of the journal under the harsh fluorescent light of the shelter's office. The quiet hum of the building's heating system was the only sound as she meticulously examined each page with her magnifying glass. Her dark eyes narrowed as she noticed something unusual, a slight indentation on the inner cover, barely visible to the naked eye. "What do we have here?" she muttered, reaching for her flashlight. The beam revealed subtle pressure marks in the paper, suggesting something hidden beneath. With careful precision, she probed the cover until a small section gave way, revealing a concealed compartment. Inside lay a tiny recording device, no bigger than her thumb. Her heart racing, Elena connected the device to a portable player. Static crackled through the speaker before a woman's voice emerged, trembling but determined. "If you're listening to this, something has happened to me and James," the voice began. "Gerald Kane. He's more dangerous than anyone knows. He's been threatening us, demanding we participate in his operations. Money laundering, drug trafficking, everything." Elena leaned closer, hanging on every word as the mother's voice continued. "The fire wasn't an accident. Kane ordered it when we refused to cooperate anymore. But there's someone who can expose him. Victor Ramos. He worked for Kane for years before turning against him. He knows everything. The recording detailed locations, dates, and specific criminal activities." Elena scrambled for paper, jotting down key information as the mother's voice grew more urgent. "Ramos went into hiding after he left Kane's organization. He was smart, knew too much to stay visible, but he promised to testify if it ever came to that. Find him. He's the key to bringing Kane down." Elena immediately called Darnell, who rushed to the shelter. They huddled over the player, replaying the message. Darnell's expression hardened as he listened, his police training already kicking in as he noted potential leads. "I know some people who might be able to track Ramos down," he said, pulling out his phone. "If he's still alive, we need to find him before Kane does." Elena nodded, organizing her notes. The twins' mother knew exactly what she was doing, hiding this recording. She must have known they'd be in danger. The recording's final words played through the speaker, the mother's voice thick with emotion. "Protect my children. They are all that matters." Darnell met Elena's gaze, his determination matching hers. "We're not letting her down." The journal lay open on the desk between them, its hidden message finally revealed after all this time. The sun cast long shadows across the crumbling sidewalks as Darnell and Elena approached the weathered house. Paint peeled from its wooden siding, and overgrown weeds choked the small front yard. Darnell's hand hovered near his concealed weapon as he knocked on the door. After a long pause, the door creaked open slightly, revealing a chain lock and one wary eye. "Who are you?" a gravelly voice demanded. "Victor Ramos?" Elena spoke softly. "We need your help. It's about Gerald Kane." The eye widened, and the door slammed shut. They heard several locks being undone before it opened again. "Inside. Quick, Ramos whispered, ushering them in. The interior was sparse but meticulously clean. Ramos, a thin man with graying hair and deep worry lines, gestured for them to sit on a worn couch. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, pacing nervously. "Kane has eyes everywhere." "We know about your connection to him," Darnell explained. "We have evidence, but we need more." Ramos stopped pacing, his shoulders sagging. "I kept the books for him. Saw everything that came in and went out. The bodies, the bribes, all of it." He moved to a window, peering through the blinds. "Kane keeps a ledger. Everything's in there. Names, dates, amounts. Enough to put him away forever." Elena leaned forward. "Where is it?" "His office. Hidden safe behind the painting of his mother." Ramos's hands trembled. "But you'll never get near it. He's too well protected." A flash of movement outside caught Darnell's attention. Through the window, he spotted a black SUV crawling past the house. "We need to go. Now." They rushed to the back door as the sound of car doors slamming echoed from the street. Elena and Darnell sprinted to their car, tires squealing as they pulled away. The SUV roared after them. Darnell weaved through narrow streets, taking sharp turns while Elena gripped the dashboard. The SUV stayed close, its engine growling. At one intersection, Darnell cut through an alley, scraping the car's side but gaining precious distance. After several heart-pounding minutes, they finally lost their pursuers. Darnell pulled into an empty parking lot, both of them breathing heavily. He slammed his fist against the dashboard in frustration. "We have what we need," he said through gritted teeth. "Now we just have to survive long enough to use it." In the dank basement, shadows danced across the concrete walls as Katrina and Janai huddled close together. Their wrists were bound with rough rope, but their captors had underestimated their determination. Katrina's eyes darted to a broken wooden chair in the corner, its splintered pieces scattered across the floor. "See that nail sticking out?" she whispered to Janai, nodding toward a rusty nail partially embedded in one of the chair fragments. "If we can reach it—" Janai shifted carefully, using her feet to drag the piece closer. With practiced teamwork born from months of survival, they maneuvered until Katrina could grasp the nail. Her fingers worked methodically, picking at the rope's fibers while Janai kept watch. The bonds finally gave way and they quickly freed themselves. Katrina's protective instinct kicked in as she scanned the basement for weapons. Her eyes landed on an old pipe, its surface rough with rust. She gripped it tightly, feeling its solid weight. They crept up the basement stairs, careful to avoid the spots that might creak. At the top, they heard heavy footsteps approaching. Katrina pressed herself against the wall, pipe raised. As the guard passed, she swung with all her strength and he crumpled silently to the floor. Moving through the building's dim corridors, Janai trailed her fingers along the walls, leaving small marks with a piece of chalk she'd found. She drew tiny arrows at crucial turns, hoping Darnell would recognize them as breadcrumbs to follow. Their progress was steady until they reached what appeared to be an abandoned factory connected to their prison. The space was vast, filled with forgotten machinery and stacks of wooden crates. The twins' hearts pounded as voices echoed from multiple directions. Kane's men had discovered their absence. "There!" a gruff voice shouted. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness. Katrina pulled Janai behind a tower of crates, both of them breathing as quietly as possible. Heavy footsteps approached from all sides, and the metallic click of weapons being readied filled the air. "We stick together no matter what," Katrina whispered, squeezing her sister's hand. Janai nodded, her face set with determination despite the fear in her eyes. Darnell and Elena crept along the factory's perimeter, their footsteps silent on the cracked pavement. The beam of Elena's flashlight caught one of Janai's chalk marks, a tiny arrow pointing toward a side entrance. Darnell's fingers tightened around the crowbar he'd grabbed from his car trunk. "3 men at the main entrance," Elena whispered, pointing to the shadows moving near the building's front. 2 more circling the back. They slipped inside through a broken window, careful to avoid the scattered glass. The factory's interior loomed dark and vast, filled with the hulking shapes of abandoned machinery. Another of Janai's marks guided them deeper into the building. Suddenly, fluorescent lights blazed to life overhead. Kane stood on a rusty catwalk above them, his expensive suit out of place in the decrepit setting. 4 of his men emerged from behind pillars, weapons raised. "Officer Darnell," Kane called out, his voice echoing. "So noble, playing the hero. Did you really think you could save them?" A movement caught Darnell's eye. Katrina and Janae crouched behind some crates nearby, watching intently. He kept his focus on Kane, not wanting to draw attention to them. "It's over, Kane," Darnell growled. "We have evidence of everything, the fire, the extortion, all of it." Kane laughed, the sound harsh and hollow. "Evidence? I own half this city. Who do you think will believe?" His words cut off as Janae suddenly lunged forward, pulling a lever on an ancient control panel. The conveyor belt beneath Kane roared to life, the sudden movement making him stumble. In that instant, chaos erupted. Darnell swung his crowbar at the nearest thug while Elena tackled another. Katrina emerged from hiding, using the pipe she'd found to knock the legs out from under one of Kane's men. Janae darted between machines, switching on more equipment, filling the factory with noise and motion that disoriented their attackers. Kane recovered his balance and descended the catwalk stairs, drawing a gun. But before he could aim, Darnell charged him, knocking the weapon away. They grappled fiercely, trading blows. Elena appeared behind Kane, striking him hard with a piece of pipe. He crumpled to his knees and Darnell quickly subdued him. The twins rushed to help, Katrina using rope from their earlier bonds to tie Kane's hands while Janae kept watch. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Darnell knelt beside the twins, checking them for injuries. "Are you both okay?" Janae clutched her mother's journal close, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's over." "No," Katrina said firmly, her voice steady. "It's just the beginning." They watched as Kane was dragged away in handcuffs. His reign of terror finally ended. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Victor Ramos took the stand. His weathered face showed the strain of years hiding from Kane's influence, but his voice remained steady as he began his testimony. Katrina and Janae sat in the gallery between Darnell and Elena, their hands clasped tightly together. "Mr. Kane approached me to handle his financial records," Ramos explained, his eyes never leaving the prosecutor. "At first, it seemed legitimate. But then I discovered patterns of money laundering, evidence of extortion, and records of payments to known arsonists." Kane's jaw clenched as Ramos detailed years of criminal activities. The twins watched their former foster father's composure crack for the first time, his usual arrogance giving way to visible unease. The prosecutor presented the contents from the safety deposit box, photographs, documents, and the crucial recording of the twins' mother. As her voice filled the courtroom, Janae buried her face in Katrina's shoulder. The recording laid bare Kane's threats, the pressure he'd put on their parents, and their refusal to participate in his schemes. Fire investigation experts took the stand next, methodically explaining how the blaze that killed the twins' parents had been deliberately set. They pointed to accelerants found at the scene and timing devices that proved premeditation. With each piece of evidence, Kane's chances of acquittal diminished. The jury took less than 2 hours to reach their verdict. As they filed back into the courtroom, Katrina gripped her sister's hand tighter. The forewoman stood, her voice clear and unwavering as she announced, "On the count of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of arson resulting in death, we find the defendant guilty." The list of convictions continued. Each guilty verdict another weight lifted from the twins' shoulders. When the judge announced Kane's sentence, life imprisonment without possibility of parole, whispers rippled through the courtroom. As bailiffs led Kane away in handcuffs, Katrina leaned close to her sister. "It's over," she whispered. Janae nodded, tears streaming down her face even as she smiled. Darnell placed a gentle hand on their shoulders. "Your parents would be proud," he said softly. In Elena's cozy kitchen, sunlight streamed through white curtains, casting warm patterns across the breakfast table. Katrina and Janae sat quietly, their hands wrapped around steaming mugs of hot chocolate, the sweet aroma filling their nostrils. The scene was worlds away from their makeshift shelter in the park, yet the twins still carried themselves with cautious reserve, their shoulders slightly hunched as if expecting everything to disappear. Elena moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. The gentle clink of bowls and whisking of batter created a soothing morning symphony. "You girls like pancakes?" she asked, her voice gentle and encouraging. "I've got blueberries and maple syrup too." Janny nodded eagerly while Katrina managed a small smile, her fingers drumming nervously against her mug. The routine of regular meals and safe shelter still felt foreign to them, like a dream they feared waking from at any moment. As weeks passed, Elena arranged therapy sessions for both girls. Katrina initially crossed her arms and stared at the floor during sessions, her body language screaming distrust, but gradually began opening up. The therapist's patience and understanding helped her navigate the complex emotions she'd buried for so long, like excavating long-forgotten treasures. Janae took to therapy differently, finding solace in expressing herself through writing. Her therapist encouraged this outlet, providing colorful pens and journals, and soon Janae filled pages with stories and poems about their experiences, each word a step toward healing. Elena shared her own story during quiet evenings, telling the twins about her childhood as a black orphan while they sat together on her worn but comfortable couch. "I know what it's like to feel alone," she would say, her voice rich with understanding and warmth. "But you're not alone anymore." Her words resonated deeply with the girls, who saw in Elena a reflection of their own resilience and the possibility of a brighter future. Darnell became a constant fixture in their lives, visiting several times a week with his infectious smile and boundless energy. He converted Elena's garage into a small boxing gym, complete with a punching bag and training equipment, teaching the twins basic defensive moves and proper technique. The physical activity helped them channel their anger and fear into something constructive, their movements becoming more confident with each session. "Keep your guard up, Katrina," he'd call out, holding up the practice pads with steady hands. "That's it. Nice combination. You're getting stronger every day." For Janae, he brought a leather-bound notebook with her name embossed in golden letters on the cover. Her eyes lit up at the gift, fingers tracing the letters reverently, and she immediately began filling its pages with stories that helped her process their journey. When Katrina mentioned her childhood interest in dance, Darnell surprised her by arranging lessons at a local studio. He watched proudly from the sidelines as she threw herself into learning, her natural grace emerging with each session, her face glowing with newfound joy. The scene concluded with another boxing session in Elena's garage, now their sanctuary of strength and healing. The twins circled each other playfully, throwing soft jabs while Darnell called out encouragement. Their laughter echoed off the walls, bright and genuine, a sound that would have seemed impossible just months before. The afternoon sun filtered through the garage windows, painting their movements in golden light as they danced around each other, finally feeling safe enough to play. The spring sun warmed the familiar park grounds as Katrina and Janae stood at its edge, their expressions thoughtful and tinged with nostalgia. The oak trees that had once provided their only shelter now swayed peacefully in the afternoon breeze, casting dappled shadows across the grass where they had spent countless nights huddled together. "It looks smaller somehow," Katrina observed, her voice steady but soft, fingers fidgeting with the hem of her clean jacket. Her dark skin glowed with health now, a stark contrast to the dull pallor it had carried during their months of homelessness, when every day had been a struggle for survival. Janae clutched her worn notebook to her chest as they walked along the winding path, her footsteps slower and more deliberate than usual. "Remember how we used to hide behind that bush when people came too close?" she asked, pointing to an overgrown shrub that had been their frequent sanctuary. They moved through the park slowly, stopping at meaningful spots that held pieces of their past. Near a cluster of trash cans, Katrina paused, her eyes distant with memory. "This is where we found those half-eaten sandwiches that one time. You were so happy because they still had the crusts on," she recalled, remembering how even the smallest things had felt like treasures back then. Janny scribbled in her notebook, capturing their memories in neat handwriting, her pen moving swiftly across the paper. "And over there," she pointed, her voice growing animated. "That's where you taught me how to look for coins people dropped. You made it seem like a treasure hunt instead of—" The twins approached the bench where Darnell had first discovered them, their steps growing slower with each foot forward. It looked ordinary now, just weathered wood and metal, but to them, it marked the beginning of their transformation from survival to living. Katrina placed a small bouquet of white daisies and purple wildflowers at its base, arranging them with careful precision. "Mom would have liked these colors," Janae whispered, touching the petals gently, her fingers trembling slightly. She opened her notebook again, writing something quickly before looking up at her sister with eyes that shimmered with unshed tears. "Do you think they'd be proud of us?" "I know they would be," Katrina replied, wrapping an arm around her sister's shoulders and pulling her close. The scent of Janae's strawberry shampoo replaced the memory of unwashed hair and fear. They stood there for a while, remembering their parents and acknowledging how far they'd come, watching as other park visitors strolled by without a second glance at them. The park that had once been their refuge in desperation now served as a reminder of their strength and resilience, a testament to their journey from surviving to thriving. As they prepared to leave, Janae turned back for one final look, her notebook hugged tightly against her chest. A soft smile played across her face as she squeezed her sister's hand, feeling the warmth and security that had replaced their constant fear. "We made it," she whispered, her words carrying the weight of their shared history and the promise of their future. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation as Darnell stood beside Katrina and Janae. The judge, a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun, reviewed the guardianship papers with careful attention. Her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose as she examined each document, her weathered hands turning the pages with practiced care. "Everything appears to be in order," she announced, looking up with a warm smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Mr. Darnell, I can see from these reports that you've already proven yourself a dedicated guardian to these young ladies. Your commitment to their well-being is evident in every reference." Darnell's hand rested gently on each twin's shoulder as the judge made her declaration official, his fingers trembling slightly with emotion. The moment felt surreal. Months of paperwork, home studies, and legal proceedings culminating in these few precious minutes that would change their lives forever. Later that evening, the rich aroma of spaghetti and garlic bread filled Darnell's cozy home, wafting through every room like a warm welcome. The twins explored their newly decorated rooms with wonder, touching everything as if to make sure it was real. In the garage, Katrina's eyes lit up at the sight of a professional punching bag, complete with new gloves hanging nearby on a custom hook. Janae discovered her writing nook by the bay window, where a comfortable chair and desk awaited her creative moments, complete with fresh notebooks and rainbow-colored pens. "I hope you girls like pasta," Darnell called from the kitchen, stirring the sauce with exaggerated concentration. "It's about the only thing I can cook without burning, though I'm taking cooking classes next month, just so you know." "Better than those sandwiches you used to bring us," Katrina teased, entering the kitchen with a grin. She grabbed plates from the cabinet, already familiar with their location, moving with the confidence of someone truly at home. Janae settled at the dining table, her notebook open beside her, fingers tracing the lines she'd written. "I wrote something today," she said softly, her voice full of emotion. "About us. About how we found each other. About becoming a family." They gathered around the table, steam rising from their plates as Janae read her story aloud. Her words painted pictures of their journey, from the dark days in the park to this moment of belonging, each sentence filled with hope and healing. As night fell, Darnell walked the twins to their rooms, checking thermostats and nightlights along the way. He paused at each doorway, making sure they had everything they needed, from extra blankets to bedside water. When he reached Katrina's room last, she looked up at him with unexpected vulnerability, her usual tough exterior softening. "Thanks, Dad," she said quietly, the word coming naturally despite never having used it before. Darnell froze, his heart skipping a beat. The word hung in the air between them, precious and new, like a delicate butterfly taking its first flight. Tears welled up in his eyes as memories of Kira mixed with the joy of this moment, past and present merging into something beautiful. Janae, noticing his emotion, crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him in a tight hug, her small frame pressed against his side. The three of them stood there, sharing their first family embrace, letting their tears fall freely in the safety of their new bond, knowing they had finally found their way home. The classroom buzzed with the quiet concentration of students working through their math problems. Katrina's pencil moved steadily across her paper, her confidence growing with each equation solved. The familiar scent of chalk dust and freshly sharpened pencils filled the air as Mrs. Bennett, her math teacher, peered over her shoulder and nodded approvingly. "Excellent work, Katrina," Mrs. Bennett whispered, tapping the page where Katrina had shown her detailed calculations. "Your understanding of calculus has improved tremendously. You have a natural talent for this." A few students nearby glanced over, noting Katrina's progress with respect. She had earned their admiration not just through her academic achievements, but through her quiet determination and willingness to help others during study groups. Across town, Janae sat cross-legged on her bed, her notebook balanced on her knee. Words flowed from her pen as she crafted her story, drawing from the depths of their shared experiences. The afternoon light streamed through her window, illuminating the pages filled with her neat handwriting. A gentle breeze rustled the curtains, carrying the sweet scent of blooming jasmine from the garden below. In the school gymnasium, Katrina moved with grace and precision as part of the dance team. Her dedication had earned her a spot as lead dancer in their upcoming performance. The polished wooden floor squeaked beneath her dance shoes as Coach Martinez watched with pride, while Katrina helped younger students master difficult routines, her natural leadership emerging through patient instruction and encouraging words. Janae's short story, Through the Shadows, caught the attention of local literary circles. The community center's director personally called to invite her to read at their upcoming cultural event. The story resonated with readers, its themes of survival and hope touching hearts across generations. Local book clubs began requesting copies, passing them from hand to hand with tearful appreciation. Both twins found themselves achieving things they'd never imagined possible. Katrina's test scores opened discussions about college scholarships, while Janae's writing garnered attention from local publishers. Their transformation from scared children to confident young women amazed everyone who knew their story. Teachers who remembered their first uncertain days now spoke of them as examples of perseverance. Darnell attended every dance performance, sitting in the front row with his phone ready to record, often bringing small bouquets of flowers for both girls. He kept copies of Janae's stories in his patrol car, proudly sharing them with his colleagues. Elena remained a steady presence, offering guidance when needed and celebration when deserved, her pride evident in the way she spoke about their accomplishments to anyone who would listen. As evening settled, Katrina and Janae sat on their front porch, sharing dreams that now felt within reach. The neighborhood was quiet except for the gentle chirping of crickets and the distant sound of children playing. The wooden swing creaked softly beneath them as they rocked back and forth. "I want to design buildings," Katrina said, her voice full of certainty, her fingers sketching invisible blueprints in the air. "Real ones that help people, that make communities better. Places where families can feel safe." Janae nodded, clutching her notebook, its pages already dog-eared from frequent reading. "I'm going to write books. Stories that show people they're not alone, that give them hope when they need it most." Looking up at the stars twinkling above them, Janae smiled softly. Her eyes reflected the gentle starlight as she whispered, "For the first time, I can actually see the future, and it's beautiful." Elena stood at the podium, her voice steady and clear as she addressed the packed community center. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she shared a story of two young girls who had survived against impossible odds. Her hands gripped the edges of the wooden lectern, drawing strength from its solid presence. "These children lived in our parks, scavenged for food, and faced dangers we can barely imagine," Elena said, her words carrying to every corner of the room. "They were failed by every system meant to protect them. But their story isn't just about survival. It's about the change we can create together." Several audience members dabbed at their eyes as Elena described the girls' resilience. Some nodded in understanding, while others clasped their hands tightly in their laps. She carefully omitted names and specific details, but the impact of their story resonated through her passionate delivery, her voice occasionally catching with emotion. The launch of Safe Horizons marked a turning point. Banners bearing the program's logo, a rising sun breaking through clouds, decorated the community center's walls, their warm colors bringing life to the institutional space. Elena had worked tirelessly to create a comprehensive support system that included emergency shelters, educational programs, and legal advocacy for at-risk youth. Months of planning and countless late nights had led to this moment. Katrina and Janae sat in the front row beside Darnell as Elena unveiled the initiative. Their matching navy blazers gave them an air of confidence they were still growing into. When invited to speak, they approached the podium together, their footsteps echoing in the hushed room. Katrina's voice was strong as she addressed the crowd, though her hands trembled slightly. "We survived because we had each other," she said, squaring her shoulders. "But no child should have to be that strong. No child should have to fight just to exist." Janae followed, her writer's voice evident in her carefully chosen words. Her gentle tone provided a perfect counterpoint to her sister's intensity. "Hope kept us going, but it was the kindness of others that saved us. Every child deserves that chance. Every child deserves to feel safe and valued." The media coverage was immediate and widespread. Local news stations covered the launch, their cameras capturing every moment as they interviewed Elena about the program's goals. Donations poured in from community members and businesses touched by the twins' story and Elena's vision. Each contribution, whether large or small, represented another person committed to making a difference. Elena spent countless hours in meetings with legislators, armed with statistics and stories that demonstrated the urgent need for change. Her briefcase bulged with reports and presentations as she collaborated with child advocacy groups, building a coalition determined to prevent other children from falling through the cracks in the system. The twins watched with pride as their painful past transformed into a catalyst for change. Their story, though anonymous to the public, became a powerful tool in Elena's mission to protect vulnerable youth. Each time they heard their experiences retold, it helped heal another small piece of their hearts. As Elena concluded her speech at the launch event, the entire room rose to their feet. The applause thundered through the community center, echoing off the walls and ceiling. She turned to look at the twins and Darnell, her eyes shining with gratitude and fierce determination. Leaving the event, Janae leaned close to her sister and whispered, her voice full of wonder. "We're not just surviving, we're making a difference. We're helping other kids find their way home too." The park glowed with strings of twinkling lights, transforming the once dark refuge into a magical space. Colorful banners fluttered in the evening breeze, their ribbons dancing like autumn leaves, and a small stage stood where the twins used to huddle for warmth. Elena, Darnell, and the twins arrived together, their steps light and purposeful, their faces bright with anticipation for the evening ahead. Familiar faces from the shelter greeted them with warm hugs and bright smiles, calling out their names with genuine affection. Staff members who had supported their journey rushed forward to embrace the girls, their eyes shining with pride at how far they'd come, while community volunteers who had contributed to Safe Horizons gathered around Elena, expressing their continued support and sharing stories of impact. The celebration began with music filling the air, not the distant sirens and street noise of their past, but joyful melodies that made Katrina's feet tap with rhythm and brought color to her cheeks. A projector screen displayed images from the past year, Katrina's first dance recital where she'd conquered her stage fright, Janae winning the writing contest with her story about hope, countless family dinners with Darnell where laughter flowed freely, and volunteer events at the shelter where they'd learned the joy of giving back. When it was their turn to speak, the twins approached the stage together, their hands clasped tight, drawing strength from each other as they always had. Katrina's voice carried across the crowd with newfound confidence, steady and clear in the cool evening air. "A year ago, this park was our only home," she began, her words touching every heart in the audience. "Now, thanks to all of you, we understand what home really means. It's not just walls and a roof, it's the people who fill our lives with love." Janae stepped forward, holding her well-worn notebook, its pages dog-eared and filled with her hopes and dreams. She read an excerpt from her latest story, her words painting pictures of darkness transformed into light, of fear giving way to hope, of lonely nights replaced by belonging. The audience listened in rapt attention as her voice grew stronger with each sentence, her creativity touching something deep within them all. "Second chances aren't just about survival," Katrina added after Janae finished, her eyes scanning the crowd with gratitude. They're about learning to live again, to dream again, to trust again. Each of you helped us do that, one small kindness at a time. From their seats in the front row, Darnell and Elena watched with pride, their hearts full to bursting. Elena wiped tears from her eyes as she remembered the frightened girls they'd first encountered, huddled and defensive. Darnell's chest swelled with emotion, thinking of how far they'd all come together, how much love and trust had grown between them. The twins looked out at their community, teachers who had tutored them after school with endless patience, neighbors who brought meals during their first weeks with Darnell making sure they never felt alone, volunteers who helped renovate their rooms with cheerful paint and cozy furnishings. The park, once a place of shadows and fear, now pulsed with warmth and possibility, filled with the light of hundreds of caring hearts. As the evening continued, the group gathered around tables laden with home-cooked food and refreshing drinks. Laughter echoed where there had once been silence, filling every corner of the park with joy. Children played tag between the benches that had once been the twins' only shelter, their gleeful shouts erasing old memories of lonely nights. The transformation was complete, not just of the space, but of the lives within it, each person touched by the power of community and compassion. They settled onto a bench together, Darnell, Elena, and the twins, beneath the canopy of lights that transformed the ordinary into extraordinary. Janae looked around at the celebration, a soft smile playing on her lips, her eyes reflecting the golden glow above. "This place used to feel like the end of the world," she said quietly, leaning into the warmth of their makeshift family. "Now it feels like the beginning," Darnell replied, putting his arms around them all, drawing them close in a protective embrace that spoke of permanence and belonging. Above them, stars twinkled alongside the festive lights, illuminating the park that had witnessed both their darkest moments and their brightest beginnings. The night air carried promises of more good things to come, more stories to tell, more love to share in this place that had transformed from sanctuary to celebration. If you enjoyed the story Katrina, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.